Noah Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you with me again. Obviously I brought you on to talk mostly about economic issues, in particular the tariffs. But I guess there was one like to call it a red flag would be an understatement. And I know this is not your area of expertise, but it's so important that I might as well address it for at least a little bit. Like, did the President of the United States just defy a Supreme Court order?
Well, it's not entirely clear. It does look like he did, but then he claims that he did not. And yeah, so the Supreme Court, what they did was they upheld the ruling of a lower court that the lower court said that Trump had to effectuate, quote unquote, the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a guy who had been deported after an administrative error to El Salvador. It said they had to effectuate his return. The Supreme Court, in a 9-0 decision, said that this lower court's ruling should stand as long as they change the word effectuate to facilitate. And so they
Yeah,
said
it's just like
that,
a minor technical thing, like from anyone's point of view.
right. And as part of that, as part of the decision, the Supreme Court ruled that, or as part of the majority opinion, the Supreme Court said that the reason they had to say facilitate instead of effectuate was because the lower court wasn't allowed to conduct foreign policy.
Yeah.
And so the Trump administration said, well, by removing all barriers to his return, we have facilitated it, but we can't tell El Salvador what to do. You know, we can't tell them to return him because he's a Salvadoran. He was in America illegally. He's not our person. You know, we don't own this guy. And so there's nothing we can do, guys. We've just removed all barriers if Bukele wants to return him. Bukele then got in the Oval Office and said, it's not in my power to return him, which to me says he's dead because Bukele has already returned, I think, 8 other people, that were deported to the Salvadoran prisons. He's returned them in the past. And so if he says it's not within my power to return this guy while chuckling as he said it, to me that says that the man is dead. But your mileage may vary. Maybe he's alive or whatever. Maybe Bukele is just lying or bullshitting or
Yeah,
just,
so like
hopping around.
maybe he's alive and he's being tortured and they just don't want to release him, so they come up with a bunch of technical BS to justify like not listening to the Supreme Court. Like that's also
Right.
possible. Yeah.
Exactly. And so basically now what's going on is the case is now being litigated again in the lower court, after which it will go to the Supreme Court again, after which hopefully the Supreme Court will offer more clarity on what the Trump administration has to do, and we'll know for sure that he's defying the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but if he is defying the Supreme Court, then you could make the argument that we don't even live in a democracy anymore. Um,
Correct. That's right. I would say that we're heading in that direction. The president has, already invoked a whole lot of so-called emergency powers, calling immigration an invasion, other things like that. And when you have authoritarian takeovers, elected leaders becoming dictators, it always happens under, declaration of emergency powers.
yeah, like just like
Like
they come
that's
up with false pretenses to justify what they want to do.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, so on that really depressing note, let's proceed with something that's also depressing, but instead focused on economics rather than democracy, which is the reason why I got you here. So I guess let's start with a larger bird's eye view of the situation. What would you say are the main differences between the American economy today and the American economy 6 months ago?
Well, right now we have a lot of tariffs, and even more importantly, we have tariff uncertainty. Whereas, so Trump, using the tariff authority that Congress delegated to him, Trump has enacted a whole lot of tariffs on a whole bunch of other countries. And then he has then changed these tariffs many, many times, gone back on some and paused others and added others, and, including tariffs on countries, sectoral tariffs on various kinds of products like autos. And so it's really just not clear what tariffs are actually in place. Also, there's been reports that no tariffs are actually being collected, given that a lot of the people responsible for collecting these tariffs have been fired. So we don't know what tariffs are actually on the books. We don't know what tariffs are actually being collected. We don't know what tariffs there'll be in 90 days. So, however, there apparently are a lot of tariffs, And so business investment is probably falling. There's lots of talk of layoffs, and economic forecasts have been downgraded. And basically, some bad things have happened there. And so basically, tariff madness is the big difference between now and 6 months ago.
Okay. Why does Trump love tariffs so much? Like obviously he's talked about tariffs so much over the past decade. He wanted to pass tariffs constantly throughout his first term, but his staff understandably refused to follow his orders or like tried their best to constrain him. Now they're not here, and now his cabinet is filled with a bunch of loyalists that'll just do whatever he says. And if he says to pass these dumb tariffs, then they'll pass them. But why does Trump love tariffs so much?
It's anyone's guess as to why Trump loves tariffs. My guess is that Trump knows a little bit of history, and he knows that America had pretty high tariff barriers in its early, infancy. And so a lot of Trump's sort of ideas are that by smashing various things about modern America, he can somehow make America revert to the way he believes that it used to be, either in the 1920s or the 1820s or whatever. And so I think that, Trump, we used to have a bunch of tariffs in America, and Trump thinks, okay, put tariffs up again, America will go back to the way it used to be, culturally, socially, institutionally, and in all the other ways that he sort of imagines he would like the America of before.
Okay, so he would like the America of before's, like before globalization, when America had much higher tariffs and much higher barriers to trade. So I guess give the audience like a very brief history lesson. Why did America stop having tariffs? Like at what point did we like relax our barriers on trade, and at what point did we like globalize and allow for far lower tariffs, if not like zero tariffs on most countries?
Well, so tariffs were always they always had two purposes. They were to collect revenue, and then they were to be protectionist. And so protectionists and regular folks who wanted to collect a bunch of revenue kind of got together and agreed on tariffs. Why did they do tariffs instead of income tax? First of all, because income tax started off unconstitutional. And a lot of taxes were unconstitutional. There were only a few ways that our government could actually raise money for itself, and tariffs were one of those ways because the Constitution delegated that power to Congress. So basically, it was a way to get money. It was a way to tax the economy.
Wait,
And
you
so,
you you meant you mentioned something interesting about how like normally tariffs, that's something that Congress decides. Do you think you could make the argument that Trump is violating the law by passing these tariffs on his own through executive order without congressional approval?
no. So Congress, a long time ago in the 1970s, said that the president can enact tariffs on his own, and that it's assumed to have automatic congressional approval. And the Supreme Court has upheld that.
All right, so he can just like in the present day, the law is that the president can enact tariffs whenever the fuck he wants. Is that it?
Yes, that's right. And there are supposed to be some certain guardrails on it, but in practice, there's not very many. So the actual point here is that Congress could at any moment pass a bill to claw back tariff authority from the president and say the president may no longer levy tariffs. We're taking that back under the Constitution. Like that's our power, so we're taking it back, and then Trump's power to tariff would be completely gone. Trump would veto it, but if they had a two-thirds majority, they could override the veto.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they did. Congress didn't even have a two-thirds majority to like convict Trump after Jan 6th. So good luck
That's right.
with, yeah.
That's right. Congress, there's no chance that Congress will have a two-thirds majority anytime soon to revoke Trump's tariff authority. Congress may, after the midterms, assuming there's no major interference, Trump, Democrats may take back the House. There's probably a pretty good chance of that, I'd say. And then then they'll have a majority in the House and perhaps the Senate too to pass that. But the thing is, they couldn't override the veto.
Yeah. All right. So like, was there like a specific period in history where the US stopped relying on tariffs and relied on free trade instead? And how did that affect the American economy?
Yeah, so in the Gilded Age, late 1800s, early 1900s, they lowered tariffs somewhat because basically international trade began to get more important because now you had before you had sailing ships, now you had steamships, and so steamships could carry a lot more stuff than sailing ships. So international trade became a lot more important than it used to be. You also had telegraph cables, so you could settle international trade much more easily. So basically, technology began to facilitate large scale international trade, and tariffs became a burden. um, a lot of people were like, okay, well, we need some other way to fund the government because they realized that tariffs are a very burdensome tax on trade and that trade was extremely valuable. especially trade between America and Europe at the time. So they realized trade is extremely valuable, and they needed some way to facilitate that. But they also needed some way to raise revenue for the government. So they said, what are we going to do? So they passed a constitutional amendment to make income tax legal so that you could tax income instead of having to do tariffs. And that's why, and then after that, they lowered tariffs because, tariffs were just getting in the way of the burgeoning prosperity of international trade.
So
And with income tax, you didn't need them anymore.
would you consider it accurate to say that it's been over a century since the US has relied on tariffs in a significant way?
Yes. Although there was a brief episode in at the very end of the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s, when Congress decided to respond to the Great Depression by enacting high tariffs, thinking that somehow this would spur American manufacturing to get back on its feet. Those were called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, and they were not quite as big as the tariffs Trump has purportedly put on the U.S. economy today, but they were pretty big. And some people say they made the Great Depression worse. Some people say they didn't do much to make the Great Depression worse because trade was collapsing anyway because of the Great Depression. But trade certainly did collapse, and some people blame the Smoot-Hawley tariffs for that.
Yeah, so the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, they either made the economic situation much worse or they had a negligible effect. One of those two is basically the debate.
That's correct.
Yeah. All right. So what if like these tariffs, these tariffs that have been passed are much larger. Could you give the audience, like, let's assume that our audience has been living under a rock. Give them a rundown about like the effect, like the general magnitude of the tariffs that have been passed.
So the tariffs that have been passed are a little bit higher, a little bit bigger than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1929. Whether those will actually be collected, we don't know. That's included, and then there's other tariffs that Trump has paused, quote unquote, for 90 days. If those go into effect, our tariffs will be much higher than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. But then, as things stand, they're slightly higher than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. However, they're much more concentrated on China. So after this pause that Trump did, after some chaos in the bond market, Trump declared a 90-day pause on many of the quote unquote Liberation Day tariffs. And if that pause holds, or if those other tariffs are canceled, and we end up with something like what we say we have now, then our tariffs will be very, very high on China and about 10 to 25% on everybody else. 25% on Canada and Mexico, 10% on everybody, and then some various sectoral tariffs like autos on top of that.
Yeah, so obviously, like if this isn't obvious, I think it's reasonable to say that you're an expert in economics. Like you're a trained economist, like you have a degree, you write about it regularly, you've been cited in the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. So like I'm asking you a question and I want your opinion on this. Would you consider it would you consider it reasonable to say that the Trump's latest tariffs are some of the dumbest economic policies that America has passed in our entire lifetimes?
I would say it is the dumbest economic policy we've passed in our lifetime.
Explain why.
Without a doubt, clearly without a doubt.
All right, explain why.
Well, so gains from trade are substantial. Trump believes that, trade deficits are bad and rip America off, and has, he set tariffs to a level that a simple ChatGPT generated formula said would cancel out trade deficits. But that's stupid because trade deficits they do not subtract from American prosperity. That's just fake. And gains from trade are substantial. So what happens is that you basically you cut off gains from trade. That's it. And so gains from trade come in many forms. One gain from trade is that you can basically buy stuff cheaper overseas, and that's the kind we usually talk about. Oh, cheap stuff. Yay, we can buy it. That's the first way. The second way is a little harder to understand. It's that gains from trade allow us to specialize. So we comparative
Wait,
advantage terms.
why does Trump and Trump supporters, why do they think that trade deficits are bad? Like what argument would they give? Like let's imagine that you're talking to them. They say that trade deficits are bad and these countries are ripping the US off. What arguments are they giving?
Right. So they have made two related errors that they may not realize are two different errors. The first error that they have made is they believe that imports mechanically subtract from GDP. If you write down a simple accounting formula for GDP, you say that GDP equals consumption plus exports plus government purchases plus net exports. Net exports are exports minus imports. Therefore, people believe that if you increase imports, GDP goes down. That is fake. That is wrong. That is not true. GDP is a measure of everything that is produced within the borders of a country. Imports are not produced within the borders of a country. Therefore, they do not affect GDP in either direction. They do not add to GDP. They do not subtract from GDP. Imports add to consumption and investment and government purchases because many of those things are imported. We don't want imports to add to those things in the formula because imports are produced elsewhere and should not add to GDP. Therefore, in order to make them not add to GDP, we subtract them elsewhere. So it's like in algebra when you add X and then subtract X later on, right? It's an accounting
Yeah.
thing because when we measure consumption, investment, and government purchases, we do not measure which of those things are imported and which are not. Therefore, we know imports are counted in there somewhere, so we have to subtract them out later. So we make sure to net them out, which is why imports are subtracted at the end of the accounting formula for GDP.
But like
However,
they might see imports being subtracted at the end and they would say, "Oh, this is a sign that like these countries are ripping us off because of the imports."
yes, correct. And Peter Navarro has in fact said this because Peter Navarro, as Elon Musk has noted, is retarded.
Yeah.
So that's the first mistake they make. The second mistake they make, which they may not realize is a separate mistake, they believe that imports substitute for domestic manufacturing. So they believe that when you import a TV from overseas, that's one less TV America produces. So they think that if you stop one TV from being imported to America, one American TV will be produced that was not produced before, which is false. That will, in general, that will not happen. But they believe that this will happen. And in fact, they probably don't even understand the difference between accounting and economic equilibrium relationships. And so they probably think that this import substitution hypothesis is the way that imports subtract from GDP. So they probably think that these two mistakes are just one mistake.
Yeah, just listening to you now, a lot of this like debunking, it doesn't even seem that intellectual. It just seems like very, very basic stuff that you learn in like an Econ 101 class or like an introductory macro class when you're learning how to add GDP numbers together. Um,
Yes,
do you think there's a so like obviously you've described it as like the dumbest possible economic policy of our lifetimes. Maybe there's a little bit of a tendency since he is the president, maybe there's a tendency to sort of try to sane wash his motives when in reality there is no intellectual backing behind what he's doing.
correct. And
Yeah.
the reasons to sane wash it are many. There's political reasons, you want to cozy up to dear leader. There's movement reasons. You don't want to admit that Trump has failed, or else people will elect people you don't like who do wokeness and DEI and trans stuff and pronouns and all that stuff that the conservatives hate. And
Yeah.
then finally, there's cognitive dissonance, which is to say, we elected this guy. We're not going to just turn around a couple weeks later and admit he's a total fucking moron.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so like I'm gonna go through some of the arguments that I've heard some people give like in defense of Trump or Trump's policies. One argument I've heard is that like this is all just a negotiating tactic. Like the whole like you know how Trump gave tariff numbers that were completely insane and then he brought them down to like 10% or whatever for most countries. Like one argument I've heard is that like the fact that he brought them down was a sign that he was just negotiating with people and he was essentially like when he was suggesting much larger numbers, he never actually intended them. And it was just a way to get like countries into the negotiating table to get them to stop ripping us off. What would you say about that argument?
Well, first of all, if you're going to negotiate, you shouldn't give up your leverage until you've actually got some concessions. And when he lowered these tariffs to 10%, or at least temporarily, he's not like there's been no concessions, right? Second of all, he put tariffs on, about 100 countries, right? And how are you going to do 100 different trade negotiations? You're not, right?
Yeah.
Like that's too many negotiations to do, and they take a really long time, and that's just a million countries to do. You can't do that many like that would take a really long time. So that doesn't make sense either. And third, people in the Trump administration, like Peter Navarro, has said that these tariffs are not a negotiating tactic. So it may be that it's just art of the deal is this sort of this fallback position that they have when they have to beat a temporary retreat because of bond markets. But ultimately, the ideological goal is still to cut America off from foreign trade, which they see as a form of foreign dependence.
So one phrase you used that was interesting was temporary retreat because of bond markets. So obviously his
Right.
tariffs on all these different countries were they were originally insanely high, and now they're just like slightly less insanely high. But then I guess, yeah, what's your explanation for why Trump backed down on the much higher tariffs that he originally intended?
Well, I think that the clearest explanation is that we started to see capital flight from America.
Explain
So
what that is.
yeah, capital flight is when people dump American bonds and move their money overseas. Pretty simple. And the last time it happened to America was the 1970s, early 1970s, with the so-called Nixon shock. But then, since for as long as you and I have been alive, the American bonds, U.S. government bonds, have been treated as a risk-free asset, both by the American financial system and by most of the global financial system, meaning that nobody seriously entertained the idea that Treasury bonds had a risk premium, that there was risk involved here. Now, people started to see some risk. People said, okay, this economic policy is so insane that Trump might intentionally push inflation, Trump might push sovereign default, Trump might do all these crazy things. So we're just going to be safe, we'll move our money out of America. And so people dumped US bonds and they bought mostly European bonds.
Okay. Are you friends with a lot of people in the tech sector or in like Silicon Valley types?
Yes.
Why have so many of them supported Trump, A, during the campaign when Trump explicitly campaigned on tariffs, and B, why do they still support Trump even after he's passed all these insane tariffs, even if they know that it would be bad for the economy and bad for their bottom lines and just bad for everyone?
There were many reasons why tech people supported Trump. But the reason why they thought that tariffs weren't a big deal is because they thought to take him seriously, but not literally, was the phrase that everyone used. In his first term, Trump did some fairly minor tariffs on China, and nothing happened. The US dollar appreciated, the yuan depreciated, and basically there was very little effect on real trade flows. There was a little bit, but very little, and certainly didn't hurt the economy to any perceptible degree. Some economists teased out a tiny little negative effect that happened, but it was like, who cares? So if you were using Trump 1 as a model for Trump 2, then you would say that he'll just do stuff that doesn't really matter and it won't really matter and we'll all be fine.
Yeah, like all this talk that he constantly is bragging about, it's just talk and it's never something that he's actually going to do.
Right, because when you looked at his first term, there was always like he didn't really break anything in his first term, economically speaking. So, in fact, economically, he did a good job. Trump did overall a good job in his first term economically.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
like
he made a few mistakes, but everybody's made a few mistakes. And in COVID, he did really well with the COVID relief stuff. And then in general, being a decent steward of the economy, he did a bit of needed deregulation. He did, the first term tariffs didn't accomplish much, but they didn't really hurt much either. And so basically, Trump did a decent economic job, not an amazing economic job, but a decent economic job in his first term. And so it wasn't unreasonable to think, oh, he's just going to do the exact same the second term. Because usually in their second terms, presidents who serve 2 consecutive terms will mellow out and not do very much in their second term.
yeah. Yeah, okay. So like they're so used to history working a certain way that they didn't realize that like all of like the extremely high staff turnover from his first term to his second term was an indication that a lot of the economic policies that he didn't pass during his first term were actually things that he was genuinely trying to pass in his second term.
Right. That people did not, peer under the hood and look at some of the micro details and make strong assumptions about what this said about Trump's governance style,
Why? So
which
like
they probably should have done.
yeah, so
But
like
honestly, I'm surprised too. I'm surprised too.
yeah. Like
Like,
this is the sort of thing where like you're surprised, I'm surprised, like everyone's surprised, but at the same time, like it's not like we weren't warned. It's not like he didn't spend like so much time just blasting this on the airwaves of social media. Like in a way, this is sort of our fault because like it's like we kept we kept assuming that Trump was not going to do the thing that he explicitly said that he was going to do over and over again. Um,
well, on the other hand, the tariffs that Trump, the numbers that Trump proposed for tariffs during his campaign were much lower than the numbers that he's now throwing out.
Yeah, but even the numbers that he proposed during his campaign, they were still very bad.
They were substantial. So the 10% tariff on everybody was something that he did propose during his campaign, and the 120% tariffs on China are higher than what he proposed, and the tariffs on Mexico and Canada and the sectoral tariffs, those are all higher. So he's doing more than he promised to do. Yes, it was bad, but I'm saying that if you want to use, even if you took what he said during the campaign as gospel truth, he's still chosen to do a lot more than he said that he would do.
Yeah. And so obviously, like since we do a lot of political research, we would surmise that part of the reason why is like obviously he was constrained by a staff during his first term that was actively like refusing to follow his orders or constantly talking him down. Whereas during the second term, not only is he filled with like people that are willing to do what he says, but like he's filled with people that are bending over backwards to metaphorically kiss his ass and like constantly tell him that he's like the greatest president of all time. So like they're
Yeah.
not just like submitting to him, they're actively like egging him on and like encouraging him to go even farther than he wanted to. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess
Yeah.
it makes perfect sense when viewed in that lens. Um, but
Yes.
your friends in the tech sector, do they still continue to support Trump now that he's actually passed these tariffs?
So I haven't talked to that many of them, but I think that a lot of them are, their support is definitely wavering, and right now they're hunkering down, cowering, and trying to, if they break with Trump too early, they could get isolated by the rest of the tech right, and then despised by the tech left, and so therefore out on the outs with everyone in tech. So if they break with Trump too early, they're kind of screwed. So what they're doing is they're waiting. They're exhibiting herd behavior where they're waiting to denounce Trump. So Elon has not broken with Trump overall, but Elon broke with Peter Navarro and engaged in a very public contest for influence with Peter Navarro, where he called him Peter Retardo, and where they traded barbs back and forth in public forums.
Yeah, so like Elon Musk is still on Trump's side when it comes to like cutting down, like throwing a wrecking ball to the federal government and getting rid of a bunch of indispensable programs or like shuttering USAID or even the IRS. Like he's still on board with Trump in that regard. He's still on board with Trump in some of the more reactionary and I would say like bigoted stuff. Like I don't think that he would ever like recant on the Nazi salute he made. But at the same time, he's opposed to like the anti-free trade policies that Trump wants to pass. Would you consider that accurate?
Yes, that's my impression, because obviously his businesses are going to get really hurt by these tariffs.
Yeah.
So I would say that's accurate, but also Elon has nowhere else to go. Like if Elon breaks with Trump, he's politically despised and like hated for the rest of his life by everybody, because the Trump people still like him somewhat because he's sort of their powerful ally, although he's proven to be a maverick and unreliable ally in some ways to them. But then but everybody else just hates him. Like his approval rating is far lower than Trump's. He tried to influence this Wisconsin Supreme Court race and ended up making things worse for his side by basically everyone who heard about his attempted election,
like he
influence,
galvanized the
voted for the other.
opposition.
Yeah, he helped the opposition on that. And so he's just he's very unpopular politically. He's not a very good rabble rouser. He's not a populist. And so basically he's kind of politically screwed, unless he gets back in Trump's good graces. But at the same time, the tariffs are screwing him substantially. So he's in a bit of a hard spot here. So he wants to get rid of the influence of Peter Navarro so that he can replace Peter Navarro as Trump's economic advisor, but Trump isn't having it. Trump trusts Navarro more than Musk because Navarro actually went to jail for him. And Musk is ultimately a sort of a rival sort of alpha male within the conservative kind of alpha male pecking order, whereas Navarro is just a henchman.
Do you think that okay, so like you talk about how like Elon Musk like he's afraid of breaking away because then he's not going to really be supported by anyone.
Right?
Um
He can't go become a Democrat again at this point. Like that bridge has been burned.
yeah. Um
Democrats hate him more worse than they even hate Trump.
Yeah, that does make me wonder. Maybe a lot of the Trump coalition, there are tons of true believers, but maybe there are a lot of people that at this point, like they're genuinely being harmed by Trumpism. Like they originally joined on for reasons that were bad and like continue to be worth condemning, but like at this point, they want to like they're worried about how Trump might be harming them, but they're too afraid to leave because they've already burned all of their bridges on the other side, like in support of Trump.
Right. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of that. There's just no alternative. Like there's no robust anti-Trump conservative movement that they can latch onto. There's no powerful and charismatic
Yeah.
figure that's not in the
And
Trump camp.
maybe in the past they did everything they could to burn the anti-Trump conservative movements that previously existed.
Not necessarily. I mean, Elon came out as a DeSantis supporter before he came out as a Trump supporter. Elon tried
Yeah.
to pump DeSantis and it failed, and then he went on the Trump train. But I think because of that, Trump has always been suspicious of Elon and suspicious that Elon doesn't like isn't a loyalist, which is
Yeah.
true. Elon's not a loyalist.
Yeah, but like even if everyone in the entire world became a Trump loyalist, Trump would just continue to be suspicious of everyone. Um,
Right.
yeah. So obviously these tariffs are very, very bad. So I guess I have another like very high level question. Is this like essentially the end of the monetary order that has existed in the world since the end of World War II?
Yes.
Explain why.
Well, so no, I would say it's the end of the monetary order that has existed since the late 1990s, so much later. So there have actually been several monetary orders since the end of World War II. The first monetary order was called the Bretton Woods Agreement, and this system was basically said that the dollar was the global reserve currency, basically legislated to be the global reserve currency. Everybody agreed they were going to use dollars for reserves fully, and that the dollar would be at least nominally backed by gold. So they pretended it was a gold standard, but really it was a dollar standard. This agreement started, it had some problems. Um, uh, and then I won't go into the problems, but anyway, they got rid of it in 1971. And then you had a lot of disruption, and it may have contributed to the inflation of the 70s. It's not clear. People don't really know. But then the Bretton Woods Agreement went away and was replaced with a, sort of floating exchange rates. And then, so that was the one big monetary change. Then in the mid 80s, you had America, very concerned about trade deficits, negotiate a foreign exchange rate intervention where the dollar was intentionally weakened against other currencies called the Plaza Accord. After this, when the dollar was intentionally weakened, countries started holding a lot less dollars as their foreign exchange reserves. And so if you look at the dollar's role as a reserve currency, it mostly goes away in the late 80s and early 90s. And so
Okay.
so the dollar wasn't, it was one of many reserve currencies in like 1992, but it wasn't the like overwhelming reserve currency that we now think of it as.
Yeah, but now maybe this is like this is an unforced error on the part of the US government that's gonna like lead to another decline in the US dollar as with regards to whether it's the reserve currency.
That's right. That will happen. And so I believe that will happen. One thing is that when you look at official reserves, those count only sovereign currencies. It doesn't count gold. And so what you might see is a return to a lot of countries just holding reserves in gold. You could also see cryptocurrency, although I think that's a lot less likely. And so, or you could see countries just hold fewer reserves, period. So countries don't have to hold reserves. Like there's nothing in the global financial system that says they have to. They can just hold a lot less reserves. And so they can dump their dollar reserves and keep their euro reserves. And then the dollar share goes down because the total number of reserves goes down. So all those things could happen. I think that some of those things will happen. Just how much they'll happen, I don't know.
Yeah. I guess like hearing you talk like in such an academic way about how like horrible and terrible and like just like unabashedly bad these tariffs are. I just like I keep like in my like the wheels keep spinning in my head about like obviously there are people that think that like the other countries are ripping us off or like this is just a negotiating tactic. What do you think about the argument that like this is like these tariffs are going to bring economic suffering, but it's all worth it in order to bring back US manufacturing?
So that won't happen because the tariffs hurt U.S. manufacturing in a number of important ways. The first way they hurt U.S. manufacturing is by preventing U.S. manufacturers from being able to get imported components. And so U.S. manufacturers rely heavily on imported components, most of them not imported from China. China's share of imported components is about a quarter, maybe, or 20%, I would say, less than a quarter. So about 20% of imported components come from China in intermediaries. And that's if you add value add. That's if you look at value added, like where does the thing actually originate? If you look at officially headline, where does it come from? It's even less from China. So, most of the imported stuff comes from like, Mexico and Canada and Europe and Japan and Korea and Indonesia and India and all those places, right? We're going to cut ourselves off from that. So with the tariffs, we're not going to cut ourselves off from it completely, but we'll cut ourselves off from it somewhat. And U.S. manufacturers will get hit because U.S. manufacturers need to buy that stuff. We can't make it all ourselves. We can make it all ourselves, but we'd have to pull people off of lots of other jobs and basically like,
They would say that like the process of us like creating all of the things that we need in order to bring back US manufacturing. It's tough, but like it's still necessary for us all to do it on our own because it makes our country stronger in the long run.
Right. So that's the idea of North Korea. This is the idea of Juche, economic isolationism. And I do believe this is the ideology that's driving them. But I will say that that doesn't mean we'll do more manufacturing than we did, because first of all, we'll have less stuff. We'll just be poorer. You know, there's not a fixed amount of manufacturing that gets done for the American consumer. That's variable and that will decrease. Okay. If we're poorer, we will buy less fucking stuff. All right. And that's reason number one. The second reason is export manufacturing. The United States does a lot of export manufacturing. Yes, we have a trade deficit, but we export a lot. Right. And if we're exporting less, that means that even if trade deficits go away, we're doing less manufacturing, period. Right. Because we're exporting less. So as we get poorer, domestic manufacturing will fall. As other people stop buying our stuff, export manufacturing will fall.
Yeah, so like I don't even know how they would respond to that. Maybe they would respond to that with like a shrug and like not fully understand the terms that you use, but trust the sources that they listen to. Um,
There's a third thing too, which is, as you know, services are produced mostly domestically, whereas a lot of imported stuff tends to be more manufactured. If manufacturing, if manufactured products get more expensive relative to service industries, people will simply shift their consumption to services. They'll buy, fewer big screen TVs and more Netflix subscriptions for their laptop. They'll buy more like, medical care and fewer like medical devices. Like they'll shift from manufactured products to services. And this will mean less manufacturing jobs for Americans.
yeah, so basically these tariffs that Trump is passing, they're not going to actually help US manufacturing. They're going to hurt US manufacturers for no reason.
Correct. And actually, there's a fourth effect, which is could be a temporary effect, but a recession, if everybody just stops buying everything because they're panicked and scared and companies aren't investing, then that will be a fourth reason why we'll see less manufactured stuff being produced in America, fewer manufacturing jobs for Americans. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a fifth reason too, which is automation. You know, it may not be optimal to automate at this point, but once you put tariffs on foreign production, it may become optimal to automate in places where people aren't automating yet. And so humans will be automated more with machines. So
Yeah.
actually, there's five reasons.
Yeah, I'm sure, and I'm sure that if a recession happens, a lot of them will say that it's necessary short-term pain in order to produce long-term prosperity that will increase U.S. manufacturing. Um,
But
yeah,
that's wrong.
yeah, okay, okay. Well, so like I'm gonna go through some more arguments that I've heard in favor of the tariffs. So there are some people that say that like some of these tariffs are like they're necessary because even if they might be bad for the economy in the short run, they will help the US fight China and compete against China, and they will help weaken the Chinese government or whatever. What would you say to that?
Probably wrong, because 20% of China's exports go to America at most. Officially, it's 13%. If you do value added, it may be as high as 20%. Okay. But less than a fifth, let's say, of China's exports go to America. If America cuts them off, they'll just find someone else to buy those 20% or 13% or whatever it is, really. However, if America cuts itself off from 100% of imports, we're really fucking ourselves. So cutting ourselves off from 100% of all imports hurts us more than cutting China off from 20% of its exports. That's just true. Besides the fact that we're pushing everyone else in the world into China's arms institutionally, geopolitically, like we're screwing over Vietnam, so Vietnam's going to get closer to China. We're screwing over Europe, so Europe's going to get closer to China. We screw over Japan, Korea, they get closer to China. Everyone who we screw over has to get closer to China.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm trying to think. Maybe they would make the argument that this is all just like Trump like being a necessary strongman figure in order to push China into I don't know changing their governance. I'm trying to think of like what kind of like reasonable argument that I can. Yeah, I can't think of anything. Um, yeah. So okay,
I
give
mean,
me.
maybe that if tariffs temporarily reduce the profits of Chinese companies by worsening their overcapacity problem, maybe this could cause Xi Jinping to change his economic policy approach to like not doing so many subsidies for manufactured stuff. But
Yeah.
that won't happen. Xi Jinping won't change that.
Yeah. Maybe like
So anyway.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is obviously I think this is a completely false conspiracy theory, but like I think that maybe some of them would say that like it's because a lot of the deep state is secretly corrupt and like they secretly are doing like they're in the pockets of the Chinese government and like these tariffs are like some way to fight back against like the deep state. I I don't know.
I
I
don't
can't.
know, man. It's dumb. Like, let's not scramble to make excuses for stupid.
All right. So, in the long run, what is your prediction for how these tariffs will affect China and like the Chinese economy and like China's relationship with the world?
I think that more countries will try to make deals with China to export things to China, and China's leaders will have to make a decision about whether or not they're going to increase imports, and in order to make their country more influential the way we did in the 20th century. China's leaders are still very strongly stuck in mercantilist mode. They're behaving like a small country. They're like, we're going to export, 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 grow, grow, grow through exports. They
Wait,
may
so
worry.
give the audience a rundown for what mercantilism is at its core.
Well, it's a little bit like Trumpism, except it's a little different. So Trumpism focuses on eliminating imports. Mercantilism is basically pump up exports. And, it's not always bad. Like pumping up exports can actually help.
Yeah.
And so I think that, uh, um, however, so China could score a big geopolitical diplomatic win by basically supplanting America and saying, okay, we'll buy your imports now. We'll buy your stuff. Vietnam, India we'll buy your stuff just like America used to, and we're the new America. And I think that China's leaders are not quite like Trump, but they also worry that this will deindustrialize them, and so they won't do it. However, I think that what could China actually do if they're not willing to increase imports to make friends with these other countries, to take advantage of America's tariffs to make friends with these other countries? I'm not exactly sure, but I think the most likely answer is nothing. I think that basically everyone is just going to sit there and think Trump is insane. Trump is a loose cannon. Trump is going to betray all his allies, which is probably that's all true. And so then they're going to look around for other allies. And so I think China's capitalization, the degree to which China can capitalize on our mistakes, will be mostly limited to the economic, to the diplomatic sphere.
Yeah. So I think the answer to this question is pretty obvious, but I just want to sear it in people's brains just like one last time. So like when it comes to all of these tariffs that Trump's passed, which group do you think is hurt more, the American economy or the Chinese economy?
The American economy will be hurt far more than the Chinese economy.
Okay. Um yeah, like yeah, maybe they would say that like the American economy is hurt more in the short run, but it's like necessary in order for like long-term growth in order to help like rebuild.
Look,
um
you can always say that. You can hit your knee with a hammer. You can smash your knee with a hammer and say that this will lead to long term gain. And like, I can tell you based on medical science that it will not. Okay. But if you don't believe medical science, if you believe like whatever RFK is selling, you might convince yourself that smashing your knee with a hammer today gives you long term gains tomorrow.
yeah.
And how do I
um
tell you? Like the paradox of induction. Are emeralds green or grew? Do you know that one?
yeah, and then yeah.
So I can't fucking prove to you that you won't have long term gains. I can just tell you that based on theory and based on everything we know from watching other things happen in the past, and based on assuming that the future will be kind of like the past, I can say that emeralds will remain green and these things will not cause, economic devastation in the long term, and there'll be, I can tell you that, but do you believe me? No. Like, so they don't believe me because you can't get crazy, stupid people or politically motivated apparatchiks. You can't get them to believe smart things at all, other than by just the collapse of their movement and their total loss and destruction.
if
So basically, what has to happen is these guys have to lose, 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 lose.
Yeah, like if I hit your toenail with a hammer, I can't prove to you that it's not going to like produce a lot of long-term prosperity for you, or that it's going to give you like superpowers in the long run, even if it hurts
Right.
in the short term.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe hitting yourself with a hammer gives you superpowers.
Yeah, like it's impossible to disprove. All we know is like all the past examples of what happened when people were hit by
Right.
hammers.
I mean, the
Yeah.
Fantastic Four got their superpowers by being exposed to high dose ionizing radiation. Therefore, I think that maybe what you should do is just go stick yourself in the CAT scan machine for an hour and see if you become a superhero. I think RFK should start telling people to do this, and then all his supporters will die, just like supporters died from COVID vaccines, and then everyone will vote for Democrats. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So we talked about how this is not actually helping the US fight China. I guess this is not even a question I would have asked in the past, but I think now I'm starting to like waver on my past moral convictions. Why is it important for the US to counter China in the first place?
Well, because China wants to screw us over, they would like us to be weaker. Now we're giving everything they want and doing that for ourselves.
Yeah, I agree that that's bad. It also makes me wonder maybe like the past few months of like authoritarianism in the US, maybe the American government has essentially lost a lot of the moral high ground that it used to have against China. Um,
Correct.
yeah.
That's
Um,
right. However, I still hope that China doesn't take over democratic countries and destroy them. Like if China takes over Taiwan, that'll be a horrible thing.
yeah.
So,
Um,
like, I don't want them to do that. I would rather not see conquering totalitarian empires conquer things and make them totalitarian. I
yeah,
don't
and
want that to happen.
it would be bad. Like China's authoritarianism would be bad, and it would also be bad if the US turned into an autocratic state, and like we should avoid both of those things.
Of course, yes. I mean, like, okay, so tell me this: who were the good guys in World War One?
Um, like the like the I think World War One, I think World War One was not as black and white as World War Two. Um,
Yeah, it's you have to really make some very nuanced arguments to claim that there were good guys and bad guys in World War One. To a first approximation, all the belligerent powers were doing bad things. I mean, maybe the U.S. was doing like less bad things at the time, but we still had like segregation and whatnot. Um, our president was like a segregationist who was supported by the KKK.
yeah, like
Like,
he screened a white supremacist film in the White House. Yeah.
right? Yeah, he was definitely a KKK supporter. Like Woodrow Wilson, that was probably the least bad. Britain was like world conquering imperialists. France were world conquering imperialists who were even more brutal than Britain. Germany didn't have much of an empire, but where it did some very nasty things to a few small groups of people. And Germany was fairly autocratic. Russia was obviously a nightmare state, just like it is now. And then Austria-Hungary was pretty bad. Like none of these guys were good. There was no like good guys like FDR sort of was, and the America were the good guys in World War II, but we really the good guys in World War One? You can argue that we're like slightly less bad. That like honestly, had Germany won World War One, like had Germany just like beaten France, taken some territory from France, and that was the end of World War One, I can't tell you that it would be a worse world afterwards.
Yeah. Whereas you could say that it would be a worse world if Nazi Germany won World War Two.
Absolutely worse world, yeah. And
Yeah.
so I think that World War II had more moral clarity, whereas World War One was merely just a bunch of assholes fighting to see who could be the alpha dog.
Yeah, so maybe right now we're like because of the US's like very, very quick levels of democratic backsliding, maybe things are a lot less black and white when it comes to like US-China relations.
Right. I think that I mean like the notion that either America or China has to be the good guys is wrong. They could both be bad.
Yeah. Um, do you think it's
And then
po
as a power in Asia, if you're India or Vietnam or whoever, you have to decide who's the lesser of two evils in terms of your own national interests. So, like, if you're Vietnam, you have to decide: do I side with China or do I side with America, or do I just uneasily try to avoid siding with either one, which is what they usually do. And so, which do you do at that point? Um, you know, if you are like, yeah, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, all these countries, like, what do you do? And so, I think for Taiwan, you basically like you're really fucked if China takes you over. But for someplace like Vietnam, it's a lot less clear
yeah,
when you're
like
fucked.
yeah, it's like I don't think that China wants to take over Vietnam for the same reason that like Russia doesn't want to take over like Poland or whatever.
Well, Russia wants to take over Poland, so I think that's a bad example.
Okay, fine. Yeah, but it's not like it's not in the front of their mind. It's
Right.
like a low salience position if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd say Vietnam would be more like, oh, I don't know, Romania, Serbia, one of those other countries like that.
Yeah.
China would like to be sort of acknowledged as this kind of unofficial suzerain of the region, big boss alpha dog of the region, but doesn't need to interfere in Vietnam's day-to-day affairs or impoverish Vietnam.
Yeah. So I guess with all the like the chaos, obviously tariffs are bad. Like the tariffs he wanted to put in place that were like insanely high, they're like even worse than the very bad tariffs that we have right now. But like one of the negative aspects of that is that there's so much more uncertainty, and like obviously uncertainty is very bad for economic growth. Do you think it's possible that like within the next few years, the American economy is essentially going to undergo something that is worse than a recession?
I think that the only way that's going to happen is if Trump causes either hyperinflation or debt default.
Yeah. But theoretically, if he were to cause that, do you think that I guess like if I were to just like find at least like a small sliver of a bright side, maybe it would at least like tank Trump's approval rating and make his anti-democratic like policies a lot less like successful as a result.
I mean, we can hope, yeah. Like the
Yeah.
good thing about Hitler was that he united the world against Hitler,
Yeah. Yeah, so
and
I
that he
guess
was
I
incompetent and told his generals to do stupid things like attack Stalingrad.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I do hope that whatever happens, whatever is happening in the future, it just like continues to tank Trump's approval rating. I can hope for that at least. Um, yeah. So my final question is a repeat of the final question that I asked you last time. What are some movies or TV shows that you would recommend for people that are trying to get their mind off of politics?
Oh, well, Black Mirror just came out with a new season that's really good. I like that. Cobra Kai just had its final season. If you haven't watched Cobra Kai, you should watch that all. Um, Movies, I don't actually watch that many movies, to be totally honest with you.
You can
Um,
just focus on TV shows if you want.
all right, TV shows. Yeah, I mean, Black Mirror, Cobra Kai. Andor's coming out with a new season. It's Andor
Yeah.
featured a prison escape from a prison that was oddly similar to the El Salvador prison. And
Yeah.
so then Andor's a good one to think about. Let's
Yeah. So
see what
it's
else.
great Star Wars, some of the best Star Wars out there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
watch Spy Family. Always watch Spy Family. That's the best. Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, the best.
Yeah.
How's
Noah,
that?
Noah Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to come back onto this podcast. I had a blast.
Thanks for having me again.